This is part 3 of filling in the SEND Reform Consultation Guide. Go and watch parts 1 and 2 if you haven't done so already. We're going to look at questions 3 to 6, which are about the new proposed tiers system. Now, ideally, you would go and read these pages for yourself so that you can understand what they're proposing, but I'm going to talk you through it. It starts on page 26, this section, if you want to go and have a look. So, the government is proposing a new system with tiers. They include universal, available to all children, a targeted level, targeted plus, and a specialist level, which is children who will have an EHCP and access to what they're calling specialist provision packages. You can see in this graphic here how it sets out. So universal isn't even on here. It's basically all children, what they should have access to in every school as standard. And then you have targeted, which is essentially things like small group interventions for speech and language. Targeted plus, where children would have access to what they're calling the experts at hand service, where schools can access time with specialists like educational psychologists, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, specialist teachers, etc. And then the specialist layer, which is children who need a specialist provision package. I've discussed this in videos before, you can go and find them. It's essentially a package of support that children will get according to their type of need rather than what their individual needs are, which is very concerning to me personally. So a couple of things to point out. Firstly, they say these layers are flexible and they expect children to move between them through their education as their needs differ. There's also one thing here that I really want to point out. It says, a child with additional needs may start off by accessing the targeted plus, or specialist layer of support, but then return to the universal offer once they are thriving in a mainstream setting. I cannot imagine a scenario where a child is considered to have complex enough needs to need a specialist provision package and maybe even a specialist school, then returning to a universal offer where there is no targeted support whatsoever. You know, we talk a lot about the idea of early intervention and how important it is, but there is only so much that you can do through early intervention. The idea that a child may need a specialist provision package, but one day may need no targeted support at all, feels a bit unrealistic to me. So essentially, the targeted support is additional support that schools can provide without much extra input. So this kind of support may include things like small group interventions to develop language skills or pre-teaching key vocabulary to help across the curriculum. Even those children who are at this level will have something called an individual support plan that every child with SEND would have under this system, which would set out the support they need. It seems that children in this category would mostly just have help from school staff after this SEND training that they will have all had. The targeted plus support is about children who need access to this experts at hand service. So they need maybe some direct therapy or something a little bit more involved, a little bit more expert input. It does say that this layer may involve time-limited support in an alternative provision or a specialist setting, which will allow pupils a short time placement for their needs to be assessed and addressed before reintegrating back into a mainstream setting. And then specialist support, which is children who need a specialist provision package. It says only those children will be entitled to an EHCP, and as I've discussed before, I'm concerned that that EHCP will only set out the provision package they're entitled to, and then their individual support plan will set out their day-to-day needs. And remember, those individual support plans are not legally enforceable. You can't appeal the contents of them or take them to a tribunal. So if your child isn't getting the right day-to-day support, your only route to challenge that will be through the school, even if they have the most complex needs and an EHCP, which is very concerning to me. It says they will have access to inclusion bases, in particular specialist bases, but also still within mainstream rather than a specialist school. And some of these specialist provision packages, it says in this document, will be for mainstream schools only. I would really encourage you to go and read this in detail so you understand the categories if you can. So in questions 3 to 6, they're basically asking how they can ensure that children in each of these layers are best supported. Now, I don't want to tell you what to write. I'm just talking about what I think after reading this document. I think the universal offer should include low or no cost, reasonable adjustments that should be available to every child. There should not need to be an ISP in place for a child to get things like movement breaks or adaptations to their school uniform. It just shouldn't be necessary. There should be more flexibility within the mainstream environment. For children in the targeted layer, it's mostly about, I think, how well-trained staff are and how inclusive the mainstream environment is. Many children who sit in this level won't have any involvement from professionals on a direct level anyway, just what teachers have learned from that training and from their interactions with experts. So it's very important that staff feel well supported, that class sizes are small enough that they can manage, that they can actually set provision that helps. Targeted Plus is where I'm most concerned. So these are the children who fall short of accessing an EHCP and a specialist provision package and will be supported through the experts at hand service, mostly within a mainstream school environment, with some time perhaps spent in an inclusion base or maybe even a short-term placement somewhere else before coming back again. I have a lot of concerns about the capacity of this experts at hand service. We know that it works out as less than a day per child with SEND in a primary school. Is that going to be enough time for these children? I'm concerned that there are children who will be placed in this level who really need more support than that, but aren't able to access it because they don't qualify for one of these specialist provision packages. So those are some of my concerns. And then children in the specialist layer, for me, this is all about making sure that specialist provision packages goes away as an idea. I think it's a terrible idea. I think it's so important that we keep hold of individual provision to meet individual needs, not limited by a package. There will be too many exceptions. There will be too many children falling in between packages where they don't fit anywhere properly, or it's too complex to meet their needs because their needs fall across 4 different packages and there is no school that can provide all 4 packages. So I have major concerns about the plans that they have for this cohort of children. So those are the things I'll be talking about in my answers. I think you should read that part, come up with your own concerns about what they are proposing, but hopefully this gives you a bit of an idea of where to start. I will come back next with questions 7 and 8. I've already covered 8 in another video, so we will talk about it again. I realise this is a very long video as I'm talking, so do save this and come back to it later. Remember that at the bottom of each page, you can save and come back later to this form. So do it in pieces like this and we will get through the whole thing together.